When an HOA's self-appointed security guard pulls a gun on a young woman for parking near her father's home, he doesn't realize he's threatening an FBI tactical commander trained to defuse hostage crises. What begins as petty HOA harassment explodes into a confrontation that exposes corruption, fear, and justice. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the manicured streets of Maplewood Heights, an affluent neighborhood where image mattered more than substance. The lawns looked like green carpets rolled out by some invisible hand, trimmed to military precision. Every driveway gleamed with cars polished to showroom shine. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful community, but those who lived here knew better. The Homeowners Association, dominated by a handful of power-hungry residents, ruled the neighborhood like a private fiefdom. Rules were enforced with zeal, and the HOA president had long encouraged her volunteer security patrol to act with authority they didn't legally possess. Most residents tolerated it, some out of fear, others out of apathy. But one man had grown increasingly tired of it. James Carter, a retired high school principal who had purchased his home to escape exactly this kind of authoritarian nonsense. James had lived in Maplewood Heights for only 2 years, but in that time, he had been fined for leaving his trash can out too early, warned for growing tomatoes in his backyard without HOA-approved landscaping, and even threatened with legal action when he parked his pickup truck in the street overnight. He knew the HOA couldn't truly enforce half of these petty rules, but constant letters, surprise visits, and thinly veiled threats wore on him. Still, he endured quietly, not wanting to ignite more conflict than necessary. That restraint, however, would come to a sudden and dramatic end one Saturday evening, thanks to a man who called himself Security. James's daughter, Special Agent Danielle Carter, was visiting that weekend. Danielle was no ordinary daughter coming home to see her dad. She was an FBI tactical commander, one of the rare few who had risen through the Bureau's ranks into the Hostage Rescue Team, HRT. She was known for her discipline, intelligence, and steady nerves under fire. Danielle had led operations where lives hung by a thread, negotiating with hostage takers one moment and charging into fortified buildings the next. For her, danger wasn't hypothetical, it was her everyday reality. Yet, when she drove through Maplewood Heights that evening, the last thing she expected was to face danger in her father's supposedly quiet neighborhood. She had arrived in her government-issued black SUV, which bore no markings but carried the aura of federal authority. Pulling into her father's driveway, she noticed an old, beat-up sedan tailing her slowly from the moment she turned onto the street. Its headlights flickered as if they were intentionally being turned on and off to get her attention. Danielle, trained to notice surveillance, clocked the car instantly. She didn't like the feeling. When she parked and stepped out, a man in a reflective vest hopped out of the sedan. He was tall but unkempt, his vest bearing the words, "Neighborhood." "Security," in big block letters clearly ordered online and ironed onto the fabric. "Hey, you can't park here," the man barked, puffing out his chest as if authority alone were enough to intimidate. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "This is my father's house," she said calmly, gesturing toward the front door. "I have every right to park here." The man's eyes narrowed, and his hand hovered near his hip where, to Danielle's surprise, a holster was strapped with what appeared to be a firearm. Her instincts sharpened instantly, adrenaline washing through her system not in panic but in hyper-awareness. She had been in this situation before, an armed individual escalating a mundane encounter into a potential crisis. The difference this time was that she wasn't on duty, wasn't in tactical gear, and wasn't backed by a team. She was just herself, standing in front of her father's home, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. "You can't just roll in here with some government car and think you're above the rules," the man sneered. His voice carried the tone of someone intoxicated by the illusion of power. "HOA rules say no oversized vehicles, no exceptions." Danielle folded her arms, her voice even and controlled. "First of all, the HOA has no legal authority to enforce vehicle size restrictions on a private driveway. Second, you're not law enforcement. You need to step back." That last line struck a nerve. The man's face flushed red, and his posture stiffened. He pulled his jacket back slightly, revealing the full grip of the handgun strapped to his waist. His hand hovered there, a not-so-subtle threat. James, who had just opened the front door to greet his daughter, froze in shock as he saw the glint of metal. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" James roared, his protective instincts overriding his usual calm demeanor. "That's my daughter you're threatening." But Danielle raised a hand to calm him, her voice low and steady. "Dad, go back inside." She never took her eyes off the so-called security guard. The man, emboldened by James's outrage, took a step closer. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do. I'm authorized to protect this neighborhood, and outsiders like you," he jabbed a finger toward Danielle, "are the problem. Now move that vehicle before I cite you." Danielle's training kicked in. She subtly shifted her stance, lowering her center of gravity, calculating the distance between herself and the weapon. She could disarm him in under 3 seconds if needed. But she didn't want to escalate unless absolutely necessary. What gnawed at her, though, was that this wasn't just about her anymore. Her father was here, unarmed and vulnerable, and this man had already crossed the line by reaching for his weapon. "Sir," Danielle said, her tone taking on the commanding edge she used in field operations, "you are drawing a firearm on a federal agent. That is a felony. I strongly advise you to remove your hand from that holster immediately." The man blinked, caught between disbelief and arrogance. "Federal agent? Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that? You're just some woman mouthing off because you think you're special." James's heart pounded. He had never felt more powerless, standing between his daughter's calm professionalism and the reckless bravado of a man with a gun. He wanted to call the police, but something in Danielle's expression told him not to move, not yet. She was handling it, at least for the moment, the tension stretched like a taut wire, humming with the possibility of snapping. Neighbors began, peeking through blinds, sensing the disturbance. A curtain shifted here, a shadow moved there. Maplewood Heights, for all its obsession with appearances, thrived on gossip, and nothing fueled gossip like the sight of security confronting someone in a driveway. Danielle made her move. In a single fluid motion, she stepped forward, twisted her wrist, and seized the man's firearm before he even realized what was happening. The gun was out of his holster and in her hand in less than 2 seconds, her body pivoting with trained precision. She pointed the barrel skyward, finger off the trigger, and barked, "Weapon secured, step back now." The man stumbled, his face a mixture of shock and fury. You can't do that. That's assault." Danielle's eyes bored into him, steel and fire in equal measure. "No. What you did was assault with a deadly weapon. You threatened a civilian and worse. You threatened a federal officer." She flipped the firearm expertly, ejecting the magazine and racking the slide to clear the chamber. The weapon clattered harmlessly to the ground, empty and useless. James finally exhaled, his hands trembling. He had never seen his daughter in action like this. He knew she was in the FBI, but witnessing her calm dominance over a man with a gun was something else entirely. Pride swelled in his chest, mingled with fear for what this confrontation would unleash. Because one thing was certain, the HOA wouldn't let this go quietly. The security guard, humiliated and weaponless, pointed a shaking finger at Danielle. "You're done, you hear me? The board will back me up. You'll be out of this neighborhood by the end of the week." Danielle holstered her stance, unshaken. "Tell the board," she said coldly, "that Danielle Carter, FBI tactical commander, is filing a formal report. And when the Bureau gets involved, you'll be lucky if all you face is unemployment." His face drained of color. For the first time, he realized she wasn't bluffing. James stepped closer, finally finding his voice. "Get off my property," he growled, "and don't come back without a badge and a warrant." The man sputtered, looking around at the gathering, eyes of neighbors, then retreated toward his sedan, muttering under his breath. The car's engine sputtered to life, and he sped away, leaving the tension of the encounter lingering like smoke after a fire. James turned to Danielle, still reeling. "You okay?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine. But this isn't over, Dad. That man didn't act alone. Someone in the HOA gave him the authority. or at least the illusion of it. And trust me, when people like that feel exposed, they double down. James felt a chill despite the warm evening air. His quiet retirement in Maplewood Heights had just turned into a battleground, and for the first time, he was grateful his daughter wasn't just visiting. She was here to fight. The night after the confrontation, Maplewood Heights was buzzing like a hive stirred with a stick. Word of the incident spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors whispered in their driveways, their voices low but their curiosity insatiable. For years, people had quietly grumbled about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, but no one had ever stood up to them in such a direct and public way, and certainly not with the kind of force Danielle had demonstrated. To the gossiping eyes of the community, she had humiliated security, stripped him of his power, and walked away unscathed. But gossip was a double-edged sword. While some admired her courage, others, particularly those loyal to the board, saw her as a dangerous outsider who had to be silenced. Inside James's home, the atmosphere was far heavier. Danielle sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning across lines of data. She had logged into a secure FBI database, leveraging her clearance to run background checks on the man who had pulled a gun on her. She learned his name quickly. Clint Harris, 42, a former mall cop who had been terminated for excessive use of force. He had no formal law enforcement training, no certification as a private security officer, and more troubling, a misdemeanor, record for assault during a bar fight 5 years earlier. James leaned over her shoulder, reading the screen. And the HOA gave this man a gun? Danielle shook her head, her voice tight. They didn't just give him a gun, Dad. They gave him authority. He's a liability walking around with a firearm. Whoever on the board sanctioned him is complicit. If he had pulled that trigger last night, we'd be dealing with a homicide investigation instead of just a confrontation. James sighed heavily, his hands braced against the counter. I knew the board was power-hungry, but this is criminal. Danielle closed the laptop with finality. Which is why I'm not letting this slide. I'm opening a file. Harris isn't just some random thug. He's operating under the guise of a homeowners association. That makes this bigger than just one man. The next morning, Danielle and James walked into the HOA clubhouse, a bland building dressed up with potted plants and inspirational posters about community living. The board had called an emergency meeting, allegedly to clarify recent misunderstandings. But Danielle knew better. She walked into the room with her head high, her badge visible on her belt, her presence a silent reminder that this wasn't going to be business as usual. The board members sat in a semicircle, led by President Marjorie Klein, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s with a smile that never reached her eyes. She was flanked by the treasurer, a nervous man named Ronald, and 2 other members whose names Danielle didn't bother to remember at first. Clint Harris sat in the corner, his face red and jaw tight, glaring at her as if his pride was the only thing keeping him from lunging across the room. Mr. Carter, Marjorie began, her voice smooth and condescending. Thank you for coming. We thought it best to address the unfortunate events of last evening before rumors spiral out of control. This community thrives on order, and misunderstandings can be damaging. Misunderstanding? James snapped, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. Your so-called security officer pulled a gun on my daughter in my driveway. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a crime. Marjorie's expression didn't falter, though her fingers tightened around her pen. Mr. Harris was only performing his duties. Our security patrol ensures the safety of this community. If your daughter had complied with vehicle regulations, this confrontation wouldn't have occurred. Danielle stepped forward, her voice like steel. Let's get one thing clear. Clint Harris is not a law enforcement officer. He has no authority to enforce anything, let alone draw a weapon on residents. And for your information, I'm a federal agent. I identified myself to him before he escalated. The room grew colder. Ronald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Danielle's badge and Marjorie's unflinching stare. Harris scoffed loudly. She's bluffing. Anyone can flash a shiny badge. Danielle pulled a folder from her bag and laid it flat on the table. Inside were Harris's records, printouts of his employment history, disciplinary actions, and his assault charge. She slid the pages across to Marjorie, her gaze unwavering. Is this who you trust with a firearm around children? Around families? This man isn't a protector. He's a liability. Marjorie's mask cracked for the briefest second, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. That's irrelevant, she said quickly. The board approved Harris after a thorough vetting process. If you have an issue, you can submit a formal complaint through the appropriate channels. I already have, Danielle said firmly, and let me make this very clear. If this board continues to arm unqualified individuals and authorize them to intimidate residents, you will be facing federal investigation. The Bureau takes community safety very seriously, and what happened last night was attempted assault with a deadly weapon. The room was silent. Harris fumed, his fists clenched, while the other board members avoided eye contact altogether. James looked at Danielle with quiet awe. His daughter wasn't just standing up to them, she was dismantling their facade piece by piece. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, her smile returning, though it looked strained now. Well, she said smoothly, if the FBI is involved, then perhaps we should reevaluate Mr. Harris's position. Temporarily, of course. Harris exploded. You can't do this. You said I was the backbone of this community. You said, enough. Marjorie snapped, her composure fracturing. This meeting is adjourned. Danielle and James walked out together, the tension in the room following them like a shadow. Outside, James exhaled shakily. You rattled them. That's the point, Danielle said, scanning the parking lot instinctively. But rattled, people make mistakes. We'll see what comes next. What came next was worse than either of them anticipated. That evening, James's mailbox was smashed. A brick was thrown through his front window with a note attached. Leave before it's too late. The handwriting was jagged, the message clear. Someone in Maplewood Heights wasn't going to let this go without a fight. James held the note in trembling hands while Danielle examined it with gloves, sealing it in an evidence bag. They're trying to intimidate you, she said, her voice calm but laced with anger. Classic scare tactic, but what they don't realize is they just handed me grounds to escalate this officially. Harassment, vandalism, threats, all tied back to a board that enabled a man with a gun. That night, Danielle typed up her initial incident report to the Bureau, detailing the events with precise clarity. She included Harris's background, the HOA's tacit approval, and the escalation of intimidation tactics against her father. She knew once this report landed in the right inbox, Maplewood Heights would find itself under a microscope it had never imagined. But deep down, Danielle also knew something else. The board wasn't going to sit quietly while she dismantled their little empire. They would fight back with every tool they had, lawyers, influence, and their loyal followers who believed in their false authority. And if Harris was any indication, they weren't above using violence. As she closed her laptop and looked at her father, who sat silently in his chair staring at the broken window, Danielle realized this wasn't just about Maplewood Heights anymore. This was about control, corruption, and the dangerous intersection of power and fear, and Danielle Carter was not about to lose. The days following the vandalism felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Maplewood Heights, once an image of sterile suburban calm, had turned into a battleground of whispers and fear. Some neighbors stopped to quietly thank James for standing. Up to the HOA, their voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might draw retaliation. Others glared openly, muttering about troublemakers and outsiders. It was clear the board's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, but when power slips, those who cling to it often strike hardest. James tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He mowed his lawn, waved politely at neighbors, and cooked breakfast like always, but Danielle could see the strain in his eyes. Every creak of the house at night made him stiffen. He double-checked the locks twice before bed, something he'd never done before. Danielle, on the other hand, was coldly focused. She had filed her report, but the Bureau moved slowly. Until reinforcements came, she knew she alone had to keep her father safe. It was a Tuesday evening when the real escalation came. James was in the backyard tending to his tomatoes when Danielle spotted movement from the corner of her eye. A shadow slipped between two houses, then another. Her instincts screamed. This wasn't just neighbors strolling. She moved swiftly to her SUV, retrieving the compact sidearm she kept holstered discreetly while off duty. "Dad," she called quietly. "Inside. Now." James obeyed instantly, seeing the seriousness etched on her face. As he ducked into the house, Danielle crouched by the edge of the porch, eyes sharp, scanning. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their faces partially covered, their movements too deliberate to be mistaken for coincidence. One of them, broad-shouldered and unmistakable, was Clint Harris. He carried a shotgun casually across his chest. The other 2 wielded bats, their body language radiating intimidation. Danielle's pulse steadied, not racing, not panicked. Years of training had conditioned her body for moments like this. She stepped forward, her own weapon drawn but held low, her voice ringing out with authority. "Clint Harris, drop the weapon now." Harris froze for a split second, then sneered. Well, well, the little FBI princess thinks she can scare me? This is our neighborhood. You and your old man don't belong here. You're trespassing on federal property. The moment you threaten me with that shotgun," Danielle snapped, "put it down or I swear you'll regret it." The 2 men flanking Harris looked uncertain, their bravado faltering at the word federal, but Harris was too far gone. His pride was shredded, his reputation in tatters, and his need to prove himself burned hotter than common sense. He raised the shotgun slightly, not fully aimed, but enough to push the situation into the razor's edge of disaster. Inside the house, James called 911 with trembling fingers, whispering into the phone. He watched from the window as his daughter, faced down 3 armed men alone, his heart pounding with helpless fear. Danielle advanced 1 step, her aim precise, her voice unwavering. "This is your last warning. Drop the weapon." Harris's lip curled. "You won't shoot. You're all talk." That was his final mistake. Harris moved, shifting the shotgun upward, and Danielle reacted instantly. A single shot cracked through the suburban night, echoing across the manicured lawns. Harris cried out, the shotgun clattering to the ground as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He collapsed, clutching the wound, his arrogance evaporating in screams of pain. The other 2 men dropped their bats, panic flashing across their faces. Danielle's voice boomed, "On the ground, hands where I can see them." Her command cut through the chaos like a blade. The men obeyed instantly, dropping flat on the pavement, their bodies trembling. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Police cruisers swarmed the street, lights flashing, officers spilled out, weapons drawn, confusion written on their faces as they tried to parse the scene. 3 men prone on the ground, 1 bleeding profusely, and a woman with a firearm standing, calmly above them. Danielle holstered her weapon slowly, raising her badge high. FBI Tactical Commander Danielle Carter. Suspect down, 2 in custody. Get medical for the gunshot wound and secure their weapons. The officers, caught off guard by her presence, scrambled into action. Medics arrived, tending to Harris as he cursed and spat, his bravado replaced with pitiful rage. The other 2 were cuffed and hauled into patrol cars, their faces pale with fear. James stepped outside cautiously, his body shaking, but his eyes locked on his daughter with awe and pride. She stood tall, unshaken, as though she had been born for this very moment. And in a way, she had. But the night was far from over. At the police station, Danielle gave her statement with clinical precision, detailing every moment of the encounter. Harris was charged with aggravated assault, trespassing, and possession of a firearm in the commission of a crime. His 2 accomplices faced charges of conspiracy and attempted intimidation. The local police were cooperative, but Danielle knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't just Harris acting alone, it was bigger. The next day, the FBI formally opened an investigation into Maplewood Heights. Danielle's earlier report, combined with the violent escalation, had triggered a federal task force. Agents, descended on the HOA offices, seizing documents, computers, and financial records. What they uncovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The HOA, under Marjorie Klein's leadership, had been running more than just a petty dictatorship of lawn, fines, and mailbox measurements. They had been embezzling funds for years, funneling maintenance fees into private accounts. The so-called security patrol was a cover, not just for intimidation, but for laundering money through inflated contracts with companies owned by relatives of the board members. Clint Harris had been their enforcer, paid under the table to silence dissenters and keep residents too frightened to push back. When the truth came out, the neighborhood was stunned. Residents who had once gossiped from behind curtains now spoke openly, their voices trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "We thought the board was just strict," one woman told investigators. "We didn't realize they were stealing from us, using our own money to terrorize us." Marjorie Klein was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and aiding and abetting criminal activity. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled as she was led away in handcuffs, her icy composure replaced with shrill protests of innocence. "This is all a misunderstanding," she cried, but no one believed her anymore. For James, the days that followed were surreal. He watched as federal agents combed through records, as news crews lined the streets, as Maplewood Heights became the center of a scandal that rippled through the county. Neighbors who had once avoided him now approached with gratitude. Some apologized for staying silent. Others thanked Danielle personally, their voices thick with emotion. And Danielle? She remained composed, her focus never wavering. She knew this was bigger than her family now. It was about sending a message that no one, not even an HOA hiding behind suburban respectability, was above the law. The night the arrests were finalized, James and Danielle sat on the porch together. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet for the first time in weeks. James looked at his daughter, pride shining in his tired eyes. "You saved me," he said softly. "You saved this whole place." Danielle shook her head. "I just did my job, Dad. The people here deserve better than to live in fear." James chuckled dryly. "Well, if this was your idea of a quiet weekend visit, remind me never to complain about boring ever again." For the first time in days, Danielle laughed. The sound was light, genuine, and healing. As the stars blinked above them and the chaos finally settled, one truth remained unshakable. Clint Harris and the HOA had underestimated her. They thought she was just another woman to intimidate, another resident to silence. They had no idea she was an FBI tactical commander, and that mistake had cost them everything.